A serving Metropolitan Police officer has admitted to dozens of sexual assaults carried out against 12 women. PC David Carrick pled guilty to 6 charges in Southwark Crown Court. These are on top of the 43 charges he admitted to in December last year, taking the total to 49. It can only be reported now for the first time. Over the course of a 20-year career, Carrick carried out 71 serious sexual offences, including 24 rapes. Chief Crown Prosecutor Jaswant Narwal made this statement after Carrick's final admissions.
This is one of the most shocking cases the Crown Prosecution Service has dealt with involving a serving police officer. Anyone hearing of the 49 counts David Carrick has pleaded guilty to against 12 victims would agree the sheer magnitude of his offending is horrifying. Today, the victims who suffered at the hands of David Carrick have finally seen justice. It is their courage in standing up against this heinously abusive man, a police officer, that has helped to secure his conviction, ultimately breaking his power and control over women. Carrick held a role where he was trusted with the responsibility of protecting the public, yet over 17 years in his private life he did the exact opposite. This is a man who relentlessly degraded, belittled, sexually assaulted and raped women. As time went on, the severity of his offending intensified as he became emboldened, thinking he would get away with it. The scale of the degradation Carrick subjected his victims to is unlikely anything I've encountered in my 34 years with the Crown Prosecution Service.
Carrick's crimes are horrific, but perhaps what's even more shocking is that over the course of his 22 years as a police officer, he was brought to a police attention 9 times. You heard that right, 9 times, including over allegations of rape and sexual assault. And yet somehow they failed to act against one of their own. Now, obviously, this is a very disturbing story. We're going to go into some of the details of the case, and there will be descriptions of rape, violence, and sexual assault. David Carrick joined the Metropolitan Police in 2001. Almost immediately, he began using his power as a police officer to prey on women in London and Hertfordshire, using his status to win women's trust, and then to silence them after he'd assaulted them. Shilpa Shah is the CPS lawyer who built the case against Carrick. She told The Guardian this: "A large number of these sexual offences were committed within 3 separate controlling and coercive relationships. Others happened during one-off encounters. It didn't matter to Carrick who the victim was, a new girlfriend, a long-term partner, a school friend or a stranger. He would still abuse them." Carrick, whose colleagues knew him by the nickname Bastard Dave, stuck to a pattern of abuse in each of the cases brought against him. This is Shilpa Shah again. There were striking similarities between what all the victims were saying. For example, that he would urinate in their mouth, something you wouldn't be able to make up and have a similar account to someone else that specific. He would force them to give him oral sex to the point where they would be gagging. Again, another similar fact between many of the complainants. He would say, "You're not allowed to eat today. You can eat tomorrow," for example. Or, "You can eat this much of a piece of apple at this time of day." That kind of behaviour of controlling how much they would eat. He would call them fat and lazy. He would tell them when they were allowed to sleep, when they were allowed to get up. A couple of the women he would lock in the understairs cupboard and not give them food, make them clean the house while they were naked. Over the 20 years that Carrick committed these crimes, the Met received several complaints about him. Even before joining the force, a woman complained in the year 2000, that he had sent her malicious communications and burgled her. Then in 2002, during his probation period, he was accused of assaulting and harassing a former partner, including biting her on the shoulder. The police took no action. There was another complaint in 2004, this time a domestic incident. Then, in 2009, the Hertfordshire police were called to another domestic incident involving Carrick. By this time, Carrick had been promoted. No longer a bobby on the beat, he now served as a parliamentary and diplomatic protection officer, just like Wayne Couzens, who killed Sarah Everard. Carrick was next investigated in 2016. The Hampshire police investigated him for harassment then. And in 2017, the police were called after he was ejected from a nightclub for being drunk. That same year, Carrick was revetted by the Met and passed. After that, in 2019, a woman alleged that he had grabbed her by the neck. Then, in July 2021, just 4 months after the murder of Sarah Everard, Carrick was arrested for rape. That was after one of his victims came forward. The Guardian reports this. Her complaint led to Carrick being placed on restricted duties rather than being suspended and having his gun taken away. But she soon withdrew cooperation from the police investigation, and within weeks, Carrick's gun was returned and restrictions were lifted. The woman was telling the truth, and in December 2022, Carrick admitted attacks on her in a pre-trial hearing. It was only in October 2021 that Carrick was finally charged with rape, after yet another of his victims approached the police. She told police Carrick had raped her. She said Carrick had shown her his police warrant card to reassure her and boasted about the powerful friends he'd made through his job. At that point, other women began coming forward, leading to the guilty pleas we are now able to report. After Carrick's admission of guilt, Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner Barbara Gray gave this statement to Sky.
This is a matter that we are truly sorry for. We have missed opportunities over time to identify a pattern of abusive behaviour. We're truly sorry for the fact he continued to be a police officer. He abused that power that he had as a police officer and used that to control the women who were his victims. And I'm so sorry that that will have prolonged the suffering that those women have had. And I'm in total awe of them coming forward now and seeing him to a successful conviction.
It has also now emerged that police failings over the Carrick case were part of the reason that London Mayor Sadiq Khan sacked then Met Commissioner Cressida Dick back in February last year. Khan released this statement after Carrick's conviction. Londoners will be rightly shocked that this man was able to work for the Met for so long, and serious questions must be answered about how he was able to abuse his position as an officer in this horrendous manner. The work to reform the culture and standards of the Met has already started, but more can and must be done, including acting on the findings of the forthcoming Angiolini inquiry. And I will continue to hold the Met to account as they work to implement the reforms needed. The Angiolini report, due this summer, is the first of 2 reports following a government-backed inquiry into the Met following the murder of Sarah Everard. It is widely expected to be devastating for the force.
I think it's important to begin here by essentially giving credit to a lot of the movements like Kill the Bill, Sisters Uncart, and various abolitionist movements that have been organizing and have been protesting around shedding light on what the reality of policing is in this country. Because let's not forget, the reason that we have this guilty conviction after 20 years on the force is not because the police woke up one day and decided to take accountability. It's because these movements created the space for understanding and awareness that about the violence that is perpetuated within policing. We can't take for granted this idea that the Met Police can be publicly scrutinized like this. Typically, it has historically had very dire political consequences to criticize the Met Police, even though it has been politically necessary. I always say, when you look at Corbynism, which expanded our imagination on so many different issues and really pushed the boat out on so many different things. And yet when it came to policing, it was like the one issue that it was believed that, it would be political suicide for him to talk about the police in any way other than completely glowing terms. And if anything, Jeremy Corbyn used to talk about, or the Labour Party of that era used to talk about funding the police even more. Let alone talking about, this idea of defunding the police and deciding, where are we actually going to spend these resources in a way that actually reduces harm. It's the movements that took to the streets in 2020. It's the people that have been writing and talking about having this critical relationship with the police. They are the ones who created this space for this mainstream reporting on something that has been true for decades. And what has been true for decades is that the police do not protect us from violence. They do not protect us from harm. And despite it being one of their main selling points, they also don't protect women from sexual violence. Most women don't report instances of sexual violence to the police because they know that either nothing will happen, or if something does happen, they will likely have to go through a very re-traumatizing and ultimately quite useless process in order to actually get what they are told is justice. When women also report behaviors to the police that often can precede sexual violence or physical violence, like stalking, for example, there's nothing that the police really will do or be responsive to in that case. So policing as an institution doesn't prevent sexual violence, and it also doesn't provide healing when sexual violence actually occurs. And if anything, as we can see in stories like this one, policing and the prison system are actually perpetrators of violence and harm more often than not, including sexual violence. When you look at prisons, for example, prisons are a hotbed of sexual violence. You couldn't design a better environment for rampant sexual violence to occur than a prison. Think about how many times you've heard jokes about dropping the soap in prison showers. It's seen as part of the punishment of incarceration. And we don't even know, the ONS doesn't even report figures when it comes to instances of violence or sexual violence from guards to inmates. They only report on inmate against inmate violence, which again is an inevitable part of the way that prisons are designed and set up. And, the reason I talk about that, because, obviously you would say, well, none of this sexual violence didn't take place in a prison. But what I'm trying to put across is that the institution of modern policing and incarceration does actually perpetrate more sexual violence than it actually prevents. It is embedded in the culture and the logic of policing. And the reason is that when you have an institution that is based on incarceration, on punishment, that has state-backed power to mete out violence that cannot be questioned by default, then this is inevitable. It is inevitable that this is how that power is going to be weaponized, especially when that institution exists within a racist and patriarchal society. So not only is that violence inevitable, but the cover up of that violence is inevitable, because it's very difficult for an institution like policing, which relies on unquestioned power to mete out violence. It's very difficult for them to both exist as an institution that can do that, and also as an institution that is fallible and is up for public scrutiny. Because in a sense, then it's then their power becomes questionable. And so the covering up is as systemically engendered as the actual violence themselves. And we know this because this man was in the force for 20 years. There were consistent complaints about him. This isn't new. This isn't that. There's not only the instance of sexual violence itself, there's the cover up in order to maintain the public function of policing itself. And so, I don't buy into the bad apple question. The whole tree is rotten and it needs to be pulled out and replaced with something radically different if what we actually want to do is reduce harm in society.